Hello everyone, I'm James Harkins, host of This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit savetexashistory.org and consider making a tax-deductible donation. Today, our guest is Justice Ken Wise, who sits on the 14th Court of Appeals in Houston, Texas. Judge Wise, Justice Wise, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Justice Wise has studied Texas history since his youth and has a tremendous passion for Texas history. He's got a podcast called Wise About Texas with over 650,000 downloads in 138 different countries. He's a professor at Houston Baptist, where he teaches history and government. He's very active in several different Texas history organizations, as well as the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. Justice Wise, can you tell me how you're doing during these current times with everything that's going on in the world?
Interesting question. Today I'm doing fine. We'll check with me tomorrow. But actually, the courts of appeals on which I sit at the 14th Court of Appeals, we've been fine. All our work is online except for oral argument, which we've been able to do via Zoom, as has the Texas Supreme Court. And so the work has not stopped. The staff is still working remotely, but we've been getting opinions out at a very good rate this year. So it hadn't been too bad.
You mentioned that you're a fifth-generation Texan dating all the way back to the Republic of Texas in 1836. Can you tell us a little bit about your Texas roots?
Sure. Dr. James H. Price, Jr. from Tennessee came to Texas to practice medicine in late 1836, and he set up a medical practice in Houston, and that was my earliest Texas ancestor. He lived in Houston until 1842. He married in Houston, and then Houston was a rough place to live, as many of the viewers will know, during that time. So he moved to Montgomery, which was more of a commercial center and prosperous community at the time, where he set up a medical practice, and he became a fairly prominent citizen. He owned a hotel frequented by Sam Houston called the Price Hotel right in the center of Montgomery, had a large cotton and tobacco operation, was a county commissioner. He built a school for girls along with his medical partner, which was nice. But he was married twice, and I'm descendant of the second marriage. He had my great-grandmother when he was 65 years old. So that's why the count is only 5.
I imagine that having a background that dates back to when really Texas was really being formed as a republic, that's really it's got to be where a lot of your inspiration and love for Texas history has come from. I'm sure that your family, whenever you were growing up, had to have talked about grandpa, great-grandpa, whatever it might be, and told you stories. Are there any stories in particular that stood out to you about your ancestors?
I think what really got me going was when we were little, in the 70s, my sister and I, we would spend a lot of time in Montgomery on land that was still in the family. My great-aunt's garden was in what was essentially the front yard of the house that Dr. Price lived in. We would find bricks in the yard, and I remember specifically running up to my mom and saying, "What is this? Where did this brick come from? This is Aunt Sarah's garden. What is this?" And then I would get the story of what existed there. And that's really what got me going. Now, Montgomery, Texas in the 70s was not the Montgomery, Texas of 2020. It was very rural and very small. I really started my interest in history by walking the ground and really experiencing it, which I think is the best, to this day, I think that's the best way to experience Texas history, or any history for that matter.
So as a justice in Texas, I'm sure, hear all sorts of interesting stories. Through your podcast, you tell lots of interesting stories. Have you had a show yet? I've listened to a lot of your episodes. I haven't listened to all of them yet, but I have listened to a lot of them. Have you done a show on your ancestors yet?
You know, I've mentioned them before. Texans love their genealogy. And I've interacted with dozens of listeners, helped them with their genealogies, as a matter of fact. And it's always interesting to preserve those family stories of Texas, because you are guaranteed to find something interesting.
Of the 90 episodes that you've done so far of your show, Wise About Texas, you talk about a lot of different, you cover a lot of different territory, from San Jacinto and the Texas Revolution to honky tonks, dance, country and Western dance clubs, Bonnie and Clyde, the Chili Queens, and a whole lot more. Where do you find the inspiration for the stories that you ended up talking about?
Well, it's all over the map. I have a running list of well over 150 potential topics. And what I'll do is, I'm getting emails all the time suggesting topics. I put them on the list. I take a look at them when I'm looking for the next episode, and do a little research and try to figure out if you can pull a story out of it. Because I don't want the podcast to be dry and just some facts and figures, et cetera, unless it's something so critical to Texas that I'm willing to do that. I love just stories like the last episode I did was actually inspired by the GLO weekly email. And so I'm always on the hunt. If I see an interesting name or an interesting fact about somebody, I'll put it on the list and go check it out. And that's real. And then there are some big obvious ones that any Texas historian has to do. So
one of the things that we've tried doing over the last several years through the Safe Texas History program is to dig in and tell those stories that not everybody knows. And that's one of the things that I think you do really well with your show, is you dig in to what people are actually thinking and feeling.
So I try to find the story within the story, and by doing enough of those over time, if I live long enough, we will have the big stories. But it'll be if you listen to those episodes, you'll have a better picture, hopefully, when you're thinking about those particular topics. Like, I haven't done the Alamo. I haven't done the Battle of the Alamo. I did Dawn at the Alamo, which early on, which was a sort of a short synopsis of the battle to remind everyone what happened. The other Alamo episode I did was Survivors of the Alamo, because that's an important piece of the story. So anyway, that's kind of how I approach it. Because I just don't think that what I want to do with this podcast needs more work than just saying, well, here are the basic facts.
Why did you decide that you wanted to do a podcast? You're a judge. You've got a busy schedule. Why did you decide that you wanted to do this podcast?
I'm a trustee of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society, and at my first meeting, I had the privilege of meeting Bill Brands, H.W. Brands, Professor Brands, and James L. Haley, Jim Haley. And for a history nerd, that's a Super Bowl meeting. I mean, it was incredible. I thought, this is great. If this is what the history scene's like, I'm all in. And because I have read both those guys for years. And so I'm chatting with those two guys, and Professor Brands looks at me and says, well, what are you working on? And I know, of course, what he meant was, what history project are you working on? What I was actually working on was my golf game. And I was embarrassed by that. And so I pledged to find something to work on. Well, I listen to podcasts when I exercise and driving and whatever, like a lot of us do. And I thought, that's something I could do, because I give a lot of speeches, as you might imagine, being in elected office, et cetera. I can do that pretty well. So I thought, wow. And I bore my friends in the car with all these Texas history stories. As we drive down the road, I point at places and say, let me tell you what happened there. Let me tell you what happened there. I thought, this is something I could do if it's not too hard to do. And so I researched how to do it, and that gave me a chance to learn something new, learn some new technology, et cetera. And that's how it came about. And I thought, well, I'll do 5 episodes and I will release them, and then I'll see if I thought it was fun and if anybody's listening. And by the time the 5th episode came out, I had several hundred people listening, and I thought, okay, this is kind of fun. And I was getting feedback, which is always fun. But I'm doing it. I started it, and I'm doing it because I love it. And I think it's important to create a record. And I think it's important to keep history in people's ears, because It's just important. And so the 5th anniversary will be this November. And sometimes I'm more regular than other times producing the episodes. But as you mentioned, I do have a fairly busy schedule, but I still love it. And it's been a wonderful experience. It's connected me with people all over the state. I've driven and talked to groups, school groups, adult groups, all over the state of Texas.
Whenever you go to schools, what's the reaction from the students? What do they talk about whenever you go to visit them?
Well, usually if it's a 7th grade class, they're pretty engaged and aware. And usually they have heard my podcast. I have tons of teachers all over the state from college level on down to 4th grade using the podcast, which I think is neat. And so they'll invite me to come talk to the school. And the 7th graders, I can talk about people and interesting stories about figures that they've studied and will remember. The 4th graders, that's the toughest audience in the world. And so you've really got to kind of make it fun and entertaining. I think the most nervous I've ever been of the hundreds of speeches I've given in my career has been in front of my daughter's 4th grade class, because that was double pressure. So you've really got to entertain them a little bit and put some interesting pictures up and stuff like that. One of the things I'm involved in with the Houston Bar Association is a program called Teach Texas, where we've taken the history of the Texas legal system, developed a curriculum, and put it in dozens and dozens of 7th grade classrooms around Houston. And that's expanding to Austin and Dallas and San Antonio soon. And they really do enjoy the things that they don't know about, because Texas history is so fascinating. I mean, it's just interesting. It just is. So all you've got to do is tell it in an interesting way.
What have been some topics that have surprised you? Maybe something that you didn't expect?
Something I didn't expect. Well, that probably happens a lot. A lot of times I'll be researching what I think is the story and then discover that the story is really something else. One example of that, I did an episode, I try to do one every now and then on Texas towns. And I'll pick a town that people either don't know about or is no longer there. And I did one on a town called Texana, which was a major port, major commercial center down near the coast, near the mouth of the Navidad River. And what I discovered during that episode was I learned a lot about the Brackenridge family, which everyone affiliated with University of Texas will be very familiar with. The other great thing about Texas history, especially the further back you go, is you find that the same people were involved in various significant incidents. I'm going to release an episode in probably a week or two about the secret court of the Republic of Texas. And part of that secret court will involve Patrick Jack, who 4 years before was at the Anahuac disturbances with William Barrett Travis. So those kinds of connections I really enjoy finding.
So you've had over 650,000 downloads in 138 different countries. How surprising is that for you?
Oh, it's very surprising. It's a total surprise. I mean, when you're doing something like this, a podcast, you want people to listen. I mean, you don't want to spin your wheels. But I really just started this, as I said, as kind of a contribution back to the historical record and the history community and that kind of thing. I'm trained as a lawyer, of course, which is simply history in a narrower field. So I knew how to do research. And so I thought, well, this is something I can do to give back. And that's why I started it. And I told myself I didn't care if anybody would listen, but obviously you do care when you're producing this kind of stuff. And Texas history is a niche. When you're talking about podcasting, there's hundreds of thousands of podcasts, and some have millions and millions of active listeners. But those are very general interest podcasts. Texas history is a niche, and it's not only a niche. You've got to reach people that listen to podcasts. So a lot more people listen now than did 5 years ago. But that is not a recipe for huge numbers of downloads in your podcast. But what's interesting about mine is they have accelerated. So for example, the per episode download in the first 72 hours of releasing an episode is probably 6 or 7 times what it was early on, which tells me that you have more loyal listeners. And certainly the feedback and engagement indicates that. So yeah, it's a surprise. It keeps growing. So I'm grateful that people are getting into Texas history, and I hope really that it keeps it on people's minds, because one of the other ulterior motives is that we really got to keep our past in our present decision making. And because if you don't, the decision making is going to be poor and society suffers.
I used to have a boss who said that there are no new public policy decisions that need to be made. Everything has already happened. It's just a change of scenery. What are some, and I guess in legal terms, setting precedent is setting history. Can you talk a little bit more about using history both in your day job and then I guess in how you teach it to your students at HBU?
So I got involved when I was a young district judge with legislative issues that affect the judiciary. So I'm walking the halls of the Capitol and trying to talk to people about issues that affect the judiciary. And what I discovered was, because I had studied Texas history, I really understood the people of Texas. Texas is very different, the different regions that you go to. And it's a lot the same, but it's a lot different. And by understanding all of that and understanding the history of the place, I understood the people that sent those representatives and senators to Austin. And it made me much more effective in dealing with the legislature. Another interesting example is I had a case several years ago, and of course I cannot now recall the name of the case, but it dealt with a closed road and land title issue in what was East Columbia, right on the Brazos, one of the earliest settlements in Texas and the first capital. And so I was looking, I had to research maps and the integrity of maps going back as far as I possibly could. And that was fascinating. So, I mean, it was directly relevant to something I was dealing with.
One of the people who I saw speak over at the Bullock Museum was J.P. Bryan, whose museum you're on the board of. And he mentioned that knowing history may not make you a doctor, but knowing history will make you a better doctor. Can you talk a little bit more about how knowing this history has helped your career in some regard?
How it makes you a better, whatever you happen to be, whatever your profession is, and what it has done for me is enabled me to engage with different people from different places who have different backgrounds and different experiences, and focus on and highlight the things that make us all the same. And that's what I'm missing. That's what's missing, I think, in 2020. I mean, we see it on our TV every day. We have a lot more in common than we do apart, and we need to focus on that, and we're losing some sight of that. Texas is particularly unique in that regard because we were so diverse from the very beginning, and you had so many different cultures coming together, sometimes amicably, oftentimes fighting. I mean, Texas is the most fought over piece of ground maybe in the world, it seems. And so, but at the end of the day, you had all these cultures mixed in. And now in 2020, the Texan identity that we have now is a combination of many, many different cultures. I didn't mention at the beginning, my mom's side of the family is 100% German from the 1840s and 1850s, the great German immigration to Texas. And so those sorts of periods of Texas history are really important to our culture. And in the legal business, for example, much of the law that I apply today comes straight from Spain. And, that's not true in other states. And so if we look around as Texans and say, and appreciate the diversity, but recognize it as Texans, then I think we'd be a lot better off. I hope that made sense.
So you're involved with, we've talked a little bit about the Bryan Museum. You're also involved with the Supreme Court Historical Society, the State Historical Association, the former Texas Ranger Foundation. Why are you involved with all of these different history organizations, and why is that important to you?
I never do anything halfway. I've been that way my whole life. If I'm into it, I'm into it. And I have a a real desire and ethic for service. You know, I've dedicated my entire career to the judiciary, which is not a way to get rich, but it is a way to serve Texas. And I think that if I'm going to be serious about Texas history, or claim to be, then I need to be involved in organizations that preserve and promote it. The Supreme Court, Texas Supreme Court Historical Society, of which I'm now vice president, sort of preserves the legal judicial history of the state. And so that's very important. Obviously, that's my business. That's a direct relation. The former Texas Ranger Foundation, I actually came into that. I'm on the advisory board now, and the way that arose was one of my father's friends had a handwritten manuscript from Rip Ford, and it had never been published and rarely seen. And it was mainly about his service with Jack Hayes in the Mexican War. So I arranged for that handwritten manuscript to be donated to the two Ranger Heritage organizations and to be kept in the vault of Company A, Texas Rangers. And so through that, I got involved with the Rangers. And then, of course, I was on the district court bench, so interacted with the Rangers in that fashion also, and got to be friends with them and learn about them and learn. And, of course, if you study Ranger history, you're studying Texas history because they were present at all of it. So it's that kind of study. And, of course, they make Texas so unique. The Texas Rangers are such a unique group that that's how I get involved in these associations. The Texas State Historical Association is an obvious one. The General Land Office, your symposium every year, which I'm disappointed you had to cancel this year, but I understand. And I just think it's important to circulate and be active and lead, if called, in those organizations if I'm serious about Texas history, which I am.
Because I work in an archive, I work with a lot of documents and maps and things like that I'm able to look at and say, man, this is really interesting. This is really cool. And it inspires me to go out there and talk about whatever that item might be. What is an artifact, document, map, painting, whatever it might be for you that you can think of in your life is something that has inspired you and something that you would consider your favorite piece of Texas history?
I refuse to pick one favorite. There are so many favorites, so many impactful things that you find. I would go back to the story I told earlier about the bricks in the yard of the old place in Montgomery. And because that's what first connected me to my past and my ancestors. That was so important. I am fascinated by San Felipe de Austin, the capital of Austin's colony. Work is accelerating out there on not only the archaeology, but the visitor center's been built, and they're recreating some of the town. And that's a very interesting, because that's a glimpse into the daily life of early Texas. My very first episode of the podcast dealt with the first judges of Texas, one of whom was Benjamin Cromwell Franklin. And I was doing some work on him, and I was going to do an episode and an article on this court that was created by David Burnett right after San Jacinto to try an admiralty case of an American ship that was captured by the Texas Navy. And I went into Franklin's papers and I discovered a record from that court that revealed, for the first time, no one had ever written about this, that court had continued to operate before the Constitution was ratified and before the first Congress had met. And that was that may be my current favorite artifact, because what it showed was how hungry the citizens were for a functioning government and the rule of law. And at the same time was a revelation, because there had been no discussion that I had ever seen of that court continuing to operate after disposing of that captured ship. And so those kinds of little discoveries, there was also a note, by the way, in his files, in his son's files, that Franklin the senior had carried during the march eastward when he was a messenger for Sam Houston. So, I mean, things like that, I never get tired of that, and there's a lot more to discover.
That's a really cool item to think about. And the search for a more perfect form of government seems to be a theme throughout American history. And
Absolutely.
uh, the early Texans, they really had their work cut out for them in what they were trying to do whenever they were forming uh, the Republic of Texas government. One of the neat things here at the land office is the first draft of the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, and we think it's the first time that the words Republic of Texas actually appear on paper. And they're just hurriedly writing this thing, copying fairly closely the U.S. Constitution, and that's
Right.
just thinking about the people that you're mentioning, or the people at Washington on the Brazos, or Austin and San Felipe, or whomever else, what life is like back then, and if they could have ever imagined what life would be like today in Austin or Houston or anywhere else. It's pretty amazing to think about. So,
Really is.
Justice Wise, I want to thank you for being here. Your podcast is Wise About Texas. It's available on iTunes. I listen on Pocket Cast, and it's available for download. His website is Wise About Texas. And I want to thank you for coming on This Week in Texas History.
Well, thanks very much for having me, James. Thanks to everybody at the General Land Office for what you all are doing to save Texas history.
On behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us here. We'll be back next time with more This Week in Texas History.